twins were into everything these days. Now more than 3 years old and full of energy, Freddie was the strongest, running ahead of his twin sister Faye, who screamed her frustration when he snatched up the toy or the bun she was after. Peggy adored them. They were Abel's children, and she often wondered what he would think of them if he walked in and saw the pair of them squabbling. It was more than 6 months since she discovered the letter her husband Laurie had so spitefully hidden. It was from Abel's friend, telling her he'd been badly wounded and had been in a foreign hospital for a long time before being flown back to an American military base. For a long time she'd feared that Abel was dead, but then someone had put a card from Abel through her letterbox, and though Peggy had looked into the street immediately, she hadn't been able to see anyone. Whoever it was hadn't waited around. However, it had alerted Peggy to the idea that there might have been earlier letters, and after the postman told her that he'd brought an airmail letter for her some weeks prior to her finding the card, Peggy searched Laurie's things. Discovering a letter addressed to her in her husband's suitcase, Peggy had been so angry that if he hadn't been ill in hospital after an act of extreme bravery saving her friend's life, she would have walked out right then. Instead, Peggy had written several letters hoping that one would reach the man she loved, but she did not know whether he was at home in America or serving his country elsewhere. Thus far, she'd heard nothing in reply. But if Abel had got one of her letters, he would now know that the twins were his. If only he would telephone or visit her so that she could tell him all the things he needed to know. Sighing, Peggy sipped the tea Nellie had poured for her. Life was so complicated. Even if Abel walked in that door right now, she could hardly just take the twins and go off with him. Her estranged husband, Laurie, was now in an isolation hospital somewhere down near the East Coast. Peggy hadn't been given the exact location, and she wasn't allowed to communicate with him for months in case her letters distressed him. Not that she wanted to very much, because she was hurt and angry at the way he'd behaved. Her feelings for the husband she'd once loved were mixed. Laurie had been injured saving Maureen Hart from a knife attack, a brave and selfless act, but he'd let Peggy down again and again, his infidelity eventually leading to her own with the young American serviceman when she'd fallen in love with Abel Ronoski. Even now, after what Laurie had done, she still felt an obligation to keep the pub running, not out of loyalty to him, but because it was her home, and for the time being, Janet's and the children's, but Peggy could have had her own business. The indecision and unease had been gnawing at her for months now, and was the reason she'd come so close to tears. "Mr. Ashley will be infectious and undergoing difficult treatment," the hospital doctor had told her and Janet when they went in to talk to him at the London, before Laurie was taken away by ambulance, "and he will be vulnerable to outside infection himself. We do not allow relatives to visit or to write letters because it upsets the patients, and at this particular time, that part of the coast is off limits to the general public." Peggy had understood what he meant. Since D-Day, when the Allies had begun the counterattack and stormed ashore in Normandy, most people had been kept away from the coasts unless they had special permits. The Allied attack had driven the Germans out of Normandy, and later from Paris, with the Free French leading the triumphant march into the French capital. The Germans were beginning to run short of supplies, and they were now on the defensive in many areas, but still fighting back and still capable of surprising the Allies as when they broke out from the Ardennes. Here in Britain and in various European countries, the V-2 rockets were causing devastation and panic. Many children had been evacuated from London when the first V-1 rockets brought death back to the streets. Janet had debated whether to take Maggie down to the country, but Ryan was buying them a house in Hampstead, and they had planned a wedding in the spring. "As Ryan says, we could be killed on a train fleeing to the country," Janet had told her mother, because many casualties had happened that way. Peggy felt she had no choice but to stay where she was in the pub. It was her living and Laurie's, and if she took the twins down to the comparative safety of the country, the business...